I also happen to get involved with a lot of developer communities. So I'm currently a developer advocate at Unstack Africa. So I'm also founder of the DevQ community, which is a new community that I just set up. And it's just basically a community for software engineers and aspiring software engineers who are basically looking to get into the tech space. And currently, you can reach out to me on Twitter, and I have my LinkedIn profile where you can reach out as well. So today I'm going to be talking on Oauth, which is an open authorization framework. I notice a lot of people happen to be confused about Oauth, and I also was confused as well as starting out, but this is just going to be an introductory presentation for beginners and anyone who's just looking to get started with the authorization framework. So the first question would be why Auth in the first place? And one of the major challenges that we developers have had when building application was to provide a single sign-on access experience for multiple computers that would require unrelated login account to access your services. So for instance, if you're on a website and then you want to have the authorizer website to have access to maybe your Google contacts, the major way of authentication would be providing your username and password to that website. And then the website would have to go to Google with those particular credentials and seek for authentication to be able to access that resource. So that's why Auth was introduced, and it happens to be a more reliable pattern than the basic HTTP authentication, where users' credentials, username and password is usually has to be stored at the DB, which is a database to create a session for that particular user. So with Auth, you are not really expected to have your username and password or to give your username and password to a particular client, which basically you do not want to trust the particular client to have access to those credentials. So what really is Auth about? So Auth is an open standard authorization protocol and also known as a framework that provides applications the ability for secure designated access. So Auth allows end users account information to be used by third parties, services such as Google or Facebook or any other service without exposing the user password. And usually there are a lot of websites that need to access other websites as well. So that's why Auth has come to be very popular in this modern age of software development. And as an authorization framework, it's enabled access to resources from different services that's widely used on the web. There are two versions of protocol, which is the Auth 1 and the Auth 2.0. The Auth 2.0 happens to be very, very popular and which is basically the most desired one that happens to be used by developers. Yeah, so the Auth 2.0 is just an authorization framework, a protocol, and it allows a user to grant access to a particular website and to access the user's protected resources. So without necessarily relieving your credentials or their identity. So with OAuth, you can read the data of a user from another application. You can supply authorization workflows for desktop, web, mobile. So there are different workflows for different applications. So for a web application, it's going to be different and then for desktop and for mobile. And you could also have your server-side web app that uses authorization code and does not interact with the user credentials. So if your application has a backend, you could have the authorization server to grant you an authorization code. And with that code, it enables you to generate an access token that can be used to access a particular resource. So for authorization, Okay, just here. Oh, you can't see me. Okay, so let me just. All right, so basically when it comes to authentication and authorization, a lot of people kind of get it mixed up. Some people would believe it's the same thing, but it's actually not. So authentication is a process of validating that you are who you actually claim to be. So for instance, someone has your username, but they might not have access to your password. So when someone tries to log into a particular account, it's usually is denied because the passwords won't match. So that's what we call authentication. So for instance, when you're signing into your Gmail or your Whomail or your Twitter account, usually there's a process flow that happens and your credentials are actually authenticated to validate that you are actually the user that you're claiming to be. So an example of authentication would be password-based authentication. And that's just the normal HTTP-based authentication with your username and your password. So authorization happens after authentication. So let's say you've been authenticated, but then do you have access to particular resources? So for instance, let's say you're on a website and you're just the user, right? And user would have just limited access than an admin role would have. So that's when authorization comes into play. So authorization occurs once a user identity has been authenticated and gives full or permission access to particular resources. So authorization verifies your right to grant you access to resources only after determining your ability to access the system. Your ability to access the system is what we call authentication. So authentication is the first access to the system, and authorization is basically a second level access to say, oh, okay, I know you are who you claim to be, but are you allowed to access particular resources? And that's when authentication comes into play. So how does OAuth work? Now that's quite an interesting question because when it comes to OAuth, there are three particular scope, or I'd say four. So you have a resource owner who happens to be the particular user, the end user who wants to access a protected resource. Then you have your client. So your client is your basic web application. So for this web application, it's going to be acting on your own behalf, and that's going to be your client. And then you have your resource server, which is where all your resources and contents are actually stored. So for instance, if you're seeking Google contacts, you want to have access to your Google contacts, there's a particular server that has that stored. And then you have the authorization server, which basically authenticates your user credentials and then generates your access tokens. So I have a diagram here just to have a brief overview of what really happens. So for instance, let's say you have a Yelp account and then you log into your Yelp account and basically you say, oh, okay, I want to import my contacts from Google. So you have your client, which is basically the middleman, and he says, oh, okay, takes it to takes your request to your authorization server and the auth, which basically is the auth server, and then transfers your user credentials. And the authorization server says, okay, is this user who they actually claim to be? If the user is validated and it turns out to be successful, then it could it would definitely issue the client an access token. So when the client gets the access token, it says, oh, okay, so I have an access token now, and it takes it to a resource server where that particular resource is located. So once it gets the access token and the resource server verifies that, oh, okay, was this access token actually issued from us? Oh, yes, it was. Then it gives the client access to the resource. So there are different flows as to how this um, whole process works. And there are basically, I think there are other flows that you could also look at if you don't want to have this. So for instance, if your web app has a backend and then it's like, oh, okay, I want to generate an authorization code instead and then verify that code and before your token is then issued. So that's another way to go about it. But this is just the basic process flow. This is how everything works. And for some time, so usually for the authorization server, it communicates to the user. So for instance, if you're making a particular request on a client website, your the third party application would definitely prompt you that, oh, okay, so this person would want to access your resource, and this is what the person wants to access. Should I allow or should I not? And when you say yes, it's like, okay, you've granted access, and that's when the client is able to generate an access token. So with Auth authentication, you can see it's more secured than having your basic HTTP connection because here your username and your passwords are not being seen and you're not trusting your client or any website with those particular details. So you're interacting directly with that service. So that's just a brief overview of how Auth authentication works. And I think that's all. So just stop sharing my screen. And then if there are any questions, I'd be so happy to answer. Okay, so it's first question, how does the resource server know about the token valid or not? The resource server asks, oh, does the resource server ask the authentication server for this token? Oh, okay. So usually when generating tokens, there's a particular way of generating tokens. So for instance, you have the JWT token, which has a signature, a header, and then a payload. So usually when tokens are being issued, okay, sorry. Usually when tokens are being issued, they're issued from a service. Now those tokens are usually sometimes cached. And when they're usually cached, then the resource server can go to validate, oh, okay, is this token really genuine? So for a token to actually be genuine, it depends on the content of the payload. So for those contents, they usually use cryptography to that's what JWT token uses. So when they are decrypted, then it's able to read where that token is coming from, and then it validates it. So that's just how it works. I hope that answers the question. Okay, so currently there's a project I'm working on that I have to use Auth, and that's basically because I'm storing. So you don't have to sign in on your own. So you could use the OpenID control flow where you could use your Gmail account or your Facebook account for that particular sign in. And OpenID is built on top of Auth and basically just for authentication. Thank you. Okay, I hope that answers your question. So, oh, so much of you guys weren't able to see my screen. Okay, so I would have to share the slides. Yeah, I'm so sorry about that. I didn't know. All right, so it looks like I don't have any more questions. Please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or on LinkedIn if you'd have any more questions. Thank you all so much. And please stay safe. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.